History often remembers the twilight of great empires as quiet eras of decay and fading glory. Yet it is the year 48 BCE in the bustling harbour of Alexandria, modern-day Alexandria, Egypt, and the air is violently alive with the roar of commerce. The morning sun cuts across the Mediterranean Sea, striking the white limestone facades of the sprawling metropolis. Down by the water, the great merchant galleys are already navigating the complex channels of the great harbour. Hundreds of oars lift and fall in perfect rhythmic unison, churning the dark water into pale foam. The scent of salt air mixes heavily with the aroma of damp cedar wood, roasting garlic from the street vendors, and the earthy dust blowing in from the deep desert. The sheer physical patience required to maneuver these massive wooden vessels against the morning tide reveals a world built entirely on the resilience of human muscle and the fickle mercy of the winds. How did an empire poised on the edge of the arid sands manage to funnel the wealth of 3 continents through a single port? What daily sacrifices kept this massive engine of trade turning so smoothly beneath the blistering sun? Let us step down onto the stone piers of the ancient harbour and watch the lifebloods of a lost civilization begin its daily flow. The harbour of Alexandria is not merely a place of arrival, but a colossal theatre of survival and ambition. As the shadows of the morning recede, the immense scale of the waterfront comes into focus. To the east, the royal district remains walled off in quiet luxury. But here, along the commercial docks, the reality of everyday existence takes over. Long, flat-bottomed barges glide in from the Nile River, sitting dangerously low in the water under the immense weight of golden grain. It's a mainstream historical fact that Alexandria, established centuries earlier by the Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great, was purposefully positioned to be the undisputed master of the Mediterranean grain trade, feeding not only its own sprawling population, but also the insatiable appetite of Rome across the sea. Every ship that drops its heavy stone anchors into the bay brings a new wave of frantic labour. Men with shoulders darkened and calloused by the sun haul heavy clay amphorae up the steep wooden ramps. They carry wine from the Aegean islands, fine olive oil from the groves of Greece, and salted fish from the distant coasts of Spain. The noise is constant. This is not a chaotic clamour, but the steady, organised hum of an empire at work. The creaking of thick hemp ropes against wooden masts blends with the shouts of harbour masters directing traffic and the rhythmic chanting of the rowers keeping time. Among the towering stacks of cargo and the bustling crowds, the quiet authority of Alexandria's women weaves seamlessly into the economic fabric of the port. While history often paints the ancient waterfront as a strictly male domain, the reality is far more complex and grounded. Women walk among the arriving merchants with papyrus ledgers in hand, checking the seals on imported goods and managing the family trade businesses. They are the silent pillars of this mercantile society. A woman draped in simple unbleached linen meticulously inspects a shipment of raw purple dye, her sharp eyes scanning for imperfections. Her daily labour, managing accounts and negotiating prices with foreign captains, provides the hidden stability that allows the great estates of the city to thrive. These women bear the burdens of commerce with a dignified grace, their contributions essential to the survival of the sprawling port. The design of this harbour itself is a marvel of ancient engineering built to command nature. A massive man-made causeway stretching over a mile long connects the mainland to the island of Pharos. Historians continue to debate whether this massive breakwater, known as the Heptastadion, was primarily a defensive military structure meant to control access to the city, or simply a pragmatic tool to separate the bustling commercial harbours from the private royal docks. Whatever its true initial purpose, it effectively created 2 distinct havens, allowing ships to find shelter from the volatile Mediterranean storms regardless of which way the wind was blowing. As the morning stretches on, the heat begins to rise, baking the stone pavements. Yet the flow of goods never stops. Alexandria is a city that thrives on unusual details and forgotten legends. There is a quirky historical tidbit regarding the very foundation of this great metropolis. It is said that when the original street grid was being laid out, the architects ran out of chalk and resorted to using barley flour to mark the lines of the future avenues. Almost immediately, massive flocks of seabirds descended from the sky to eat the grain. While some panicked at the sight, seers quickly interpreted this strange event as a divine omen, declaring that the city built on those lines would one day provide nourishment for the entire world. Standing on the docks centuries later, surrounded by mountains of wheat bound for distant shores, the prophecy feels vividly real. The people who labour here do not think of prophecies. They think of the day ahead, the heavy lifting, and the bronze coins they will carry home to their families. There is a profound shared humanity in watching a dockworker pause to wipe the sweat from his brow, pulling a simple clay flask from his belt to drink tepid water. The physical toll is immense, yet the city moves with an undeniable rhythm, a testament to the endurance of ordinary people navigating a harsh, unforgiving environment. Beyond the docks, the city rises in a grid of wide avenues and towering colonnades, promising shade and fresh water. But the harbour remains the beating heart, pumping life into the stone veins of Alexandria. Every sack of grain, every jar of oil, and every rolled manuscript that passes through these docks represents a connection to a wider, mysterious world. The harbour is a place of beginnings and endings, where fortunes are made before the sun reaches its peak. The sun now hangs high over the Mediterranean, its light reflecting fiercely off the restless water. The morning rush begins to settle into the steady, gruelling endurance of midday labour. The wealth of the world has arrived on these shores, meticulously catalogued by scribes and guarded by the state. The physical strength of the harbour has secured the kingdom for another day, but as the sheer volume of this trade shifts inward toward the heart of the city, one must wonder, how did the royal minds behind those high stone walls orchestrate such a vast, intricate machine of politics and survival? Moving inland from the waterfront, the noise of the commercial docks begins to fade, replaced by a profound, heavily guarded quiet. The royal district of Alexandria, known as the Bruchion, rises like a fortress of polished marble and lush, imported greenery. High, impenetrable limestone walls strictly separate this glittering world from the crowded, dusty streets of the common city. Behind these massive barriers, the palace of the Ptolemies does not merely exist as a residence. It operates as a vast, complex machine of intellect, diplomacy, and survival. The air here is noticeably cooler, sweetened by the scent of blooming lotus and burning myrrh. The harsh Mediterranean sunlight is filtered through elaborate linen awnings, casting soft, swaying shadows across courtyards paved with intricate geometric mosaics. To walk through the royal quarter is to wander through a landscape built to overwhelm the senses. It is not a single building, but a sprawling, interconnected city within a city, taking up nearly a third of Alexandria itself. Covered walkways connect grand dining pavilions to private botanical gardens, where exotic trees from the distant lands of India and Syria take root in Egyptian soil. Water is a constant presence. It trickles down carved stone channels, bringing life to the manicured groves and cooling the heavy afternoon air. This environment is purposefully designed to project absolute divine authority, subtly masking the fragile, deeply human reality of the dynasty that rules within its walls. At the heart of this intricate web of power sits the queen, Cleopatra. History often focuses entirely on the romantic spectacles of her reign, yet the daily reality of her court is rooted in exhausting, relentless administration. It is a mainstream historical fact that Cleopatra was the very first ruler of her Greek-speaking dynasty to actually learn and fluently speak the native Egyptian language, along with the tongues of the Ethiopians, Medes, Syrians, and Arabs. In the cool, shaded audience halls, she refuses to rely on the slowly filtered, often unreliable translations of royal interpreters. She listens directly to the grievances of local priests, reads the subtle inflections in a foreign diplomat's voice, and issues commands with a sharp, unfiltered clarity. This linguistic mastery is a profound tool of survival, allowing her to hold together a fractured empire through the sheer force of her own intellect. Yet she does not bear the weight of the crown alone. In the cool shadows of the marble corridors, the true stabilizing anchors of the palace are often the women who surround the throne. A quiet, formidable network of educated noblewomen, attendants, and trusted advisors carefully manages the internal life of the dynasty. They are the unseen, deeply influential diplomats of the ancient court. While men may shout in the military councils, it is these women who arrange the vital marriages, draft the delicate correspondence, and maintain the fragile social alliances that keep the kingdom from tearing itself apart. They move with a dignified grace, their heavy linen garments brushing softly against the stone floors, holding the massive burdens of statecraft in their capable hands. Their deep understanding of philosophy, literature, and human nature provides a constant, steadying undercurrent to the volatile world of royal politics. The physical space they navigate is as complex as the politics they meticulously manage. The royal grounds are filled with strange wonders and hidden monuments, revealing the eccentricities of the rulers who came before. There is a deeply fascinating, unusual tidbit recorded by ancient chroniclers regarding the very centre of this royal district. It is said that within the palace walls rested the actual tomb of Alexander the Great, but the legendary conqueror did not rest in gold. A previous Ptolemaic king, desperate to pay his mercenary armies, had allegedly melted down the original solid gold sarcophagus, replacing it with a coffin made entirely of clear, heavy glass. For generations, visiting dignitaries and favoured nobles could peer through the glass to look upon the preserved features of the man who had conquered the known world, a haunting, transparent reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly glory. The architecture surrounding such wonders is equally perplexing and layered in mystery. Historians continue to debate whether the sprawling, labyrinthine layout of the royal district was deliberately designed as a psychological maze to confuse and intimidate visiting Roman generals, or if it was simply the chaotic, unplanned result of successive pharaohs endlessly adding their own grand pavilions over 3 centuries. Whatever the original intent, the result is a disorienting world of endless columns, hidden gardens, and sudden, breathtaking views of the sea. It is a place where secrets are easily hidden in the shadows, and where every whispered conversation can shape the fate of thousands. As the afternoon deepens, the shadows in the palace gradually lengthen. Scribes sit cross-legged on the cool floors, their reed pens scratching quickly across coarse papyrus as they record the tax yields from the distant farming provinces. The immense wealth that surrounds them, the bright gold leaf on the ceilings, the blue lapis lazuli carved into the statues, the fine silver wine cups resting on the tables, is all drawn from the relentless, grinding labour of the common people outside these walls. The glittering machine of the court is entirely dependent on the quiet, uncelebrated rhythm of the wider city. The astute noble women of the palace profoundly understand this delicate, precarious balance. They know that the fine silk they wear and the fragrant oils they use are the final products of countless unseen hands labouring in the heat. The survival of the elite is forever tethered to the endurance of the ordinary people. But while the queens and their companions navigate the dangerous, high-stakes currents of royal diplomacy, who are the steady, patient hands spinning the actual threads of the city's wealth in the dusty, sun-baked courtyards miles away from the palace gates. The royal palaces may project an image of effortless divine rule, but the true weight of Alexandria rests squarely on the shoulders of those living far beyond the marble walls. Leaving the shaded groves of the Bruchion, the wide avenues narrow into the dense, sun-baked residential grids of the common city. Here, the air is thick with the smell of raw wool, baking flatbread, and the sharp scent of indigo dye. The imposing silence of the royal quarter is replaced by a steady, rhythmic thumping that echoes from nearly every open courtyard. It is the sound of the heavy wooden looms, beating relentlessly under the harsh midday light. In the shaded corners of domestic courtyards, away from the grand political theatres, the diligent women of Alexandria sit before these towering, upright frames. They are the silent, uncelebrated architects of the city's wealth. Their hands move with a practiced, almost hypnotic rhythm, passing the wooden shuttle back and forth through a tight web of taut linen threads. It is a labour of profound patience and physical endurance. The heavy stone weights that hold the vertical threads in place must be constantly adjusted, pulling at the muscles of the back and shoulders hour after hour. Yet there is a deep, quiet dignity in this work. These women are not merely making clothes, they are literally weaving the foundational economic fabric of their society. It is a mainstream historical fact that Ptolemaic Egypt operated heavily on a dual economy, where women frequently used their woven textiles, primarily high-quality linen, as a direct form of currency. In the bustling local markets, a finely crafted tunic or a durable shipsail was often traded directly for vital household necessities like grain, olive oil, or even used to pay monthly rent. Through this demanding craft, women operated as highly effective independent economic agents. They managed complex household budgets and secured their family's survival through the sheer calloused skill of their own hands. This daily reality highlights the profound, equal role of women in maintaining the stability of the ancient world. They are the quiet anchors of the community. While male merchants might shout over large shipments of foreign goods down at the docks, the local economy runs on the meticulous daily negotiations conducted by women in the neighbourhood squares. They expertly judge the tension of a thread, the purity of a dyed fabric, and the fair weight of traded grain. Their sharp eyes and steady judgment prevent households from falling into ruin. Their burdens are immense, carried with without the promise of statues or grand inscriptions, yet their presence is the very mortar that holds the neighbourhood together. The loom itself is more than just a tool. It is a focal point of domestic life and ancient belief. There is a quirky historical tidbit regarding the superstitious practices of these ancient weavers. It was common for women to tie small, roughly carved amulets of the dwarf god Bes to the wooden frames of their looms. Bes was widely revered as a fierce protector of the household and a champion of everyday labour. Weavers firmly believed that a sudden, inexplicable tangle or a snapped thread was not caused by friction or simple error, but was the mischievous work of invisible, restless spirits drifting through the courtyard. By attaching the amulet, they sought to ward off this unseen interference, blending their intense physical labour with a constant quiet dialogue with the divine. Around these protected looms, a vital, silent transfer of culture takes place. Older women sit beside the young girls, guiding their small hands, teaching them how to maintain an even tension and how to recognise the precise moment a thread might break. This is where the true heritage of Alexandria is passed down. It is not found in the grand decrees of the pharaohs, but in these quiet moments of shared effort, in the patient correction of a mistake, and in the deep, unspoken understanding of the hardships that lie ahead. The older women bear the physical scars of their lifelong trade, the stooped shoulders, the calloused fingers, the squinting eyes, yet they pass their knowledge forward with a steady, enduring warmth. The sheer volume of cloth produced in these domestic courtyards was staggering, leading to lingering questions about the true scale of this female-driven industry. Historians continue to debate whether the massive output of these home looms was meant purely for local, neighbourhood survival, or if it secretly fed into a highly organised, heavily taxed shadow economy that exported everyday textiles far beyond the borders of Egypt. If the latter is true, then the quiet work of these women did not just clothe their children, but systematically funded the military campaigns and grand building projects of the very kings who ignored them. As the afternoon heat reaches its peak, the rhythmic thumping of the looms begins to slow, but it never entirely stops. The women wipe the sweat from their faces with the backs of their hands, taking small sips of water from porous clay jugs designed to keep the liquid cool. Their daily reality is a testament to human resilience. They do not have the luxury of philosophical contemplation or political debate. Their lives are measured in yards of finished cloth and the steady provision of bread for their families. The threads they spin are strong, meant to endure the harsh desert winds and the abrasive salt of the sea. They are the practical, unsung heroes of Alexandria, holding the chaotic, multi-ethnic city together through relentless, grounding routine. But while these women patiently weave the physical threads that clothe an empire and fill its local markets, who sits in the quiet, dustless halls across the city, painstakingly attempting to weave the delicate, invisible strands of human thought into something that could outlast the fragile papyrus of time. Beyond the sun-baked residential grids, where the rhythmic thumping of heavy looms sets the grueling tempo of the neighbourhood, the city of Alexandria hides another world entirely. It is a place of absolute, deliberate quiet, a sanctuary built not for physical labour, but for the fierce, invisible work of the mind. Deep within the protected precincts of the royal district, surrounded by shaded colonnades and the gentle murmur of ornamental stone fountains, stands the legendary Great Library. Here, the air does not smell of raw wool, salt water, or baking bread. Instead, it carries the dry, earthy scent of aged papyrus, crushed ink galls, and the sharp, resinous tang of the cedar oil used to keep the insects at bay. Shafts of pure sunlight pierce the narrow, high windows, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes that settle softly over the shoulders of men and women hunched over long wooden tables. This is the intellectual heart of the ancient world. It is not merely a static repository of forgotten scrolls, but a living, breathing organism of human memory. In these hushed corridors, the brightest minds of the Mediterranean gather to map the distant stars, debate the eternal nature of the soul, and meticulously copy the fragile wisdom of their ancestors. The sheer scale of this ambition is staggering to comprehend. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Ptolemaic rulers were so obsessed with gathering the world's knowledge that they enacted a ruthless, sweeping law at the harbour. Any ship arriving in Alexandria was immediately boarded and searched by armed royal guards, not merely for smuggled goods or foreign weapons, but for books. If a new scroll was found, it was confiscated and brought directly to the library. Scribes would carefully copy the text, handing the fresh replica back to the frustrated ship captain while the precious original manuscript was locked away forever in the royal archives. This relentless, aggressive accumulation created a staggering mountain of knowledge, but making sense of it required an army of unseen, dedicated labourers. Among the endless rows of scholars, the profound intellect and steady hands of educated women provide a vital, stabilising force within the chaotic sea of ancient literature. History often prefers to focus on the famous male philosophers who loudly shouted their rival theories in the open courtyards, but within the quiet, shadowy copying rooms, women, often the daughters, wives and sisters of prominent scholars, perform the exhausting, meticulous work of true preservation. They are the silent guardians of the written word. With deep concentration, they unroll crumbling manuscripts imported from distant lands, their sharp eyes scanning the faded Greek, Aramaic and Egyptian characters. These women possess a rigorous classical education, an innate understanding of complex linguistic grammar, and a deep well of unparalleled patience. They work in pairs, one reading quietly aloud while the other dips a stiff reed pen into a shallow dish of black soot ink, cross-referencing translations and correcting the clumsy errors of previous scribes. Their uncelebrated labour is the very bedrock of the library's lasting greatness. Without their sharp minds and their quiet, methodical devotion, the grand theories of the men outside would simply vanish into the dust of poorly translated fragments. They carry the immense burden of the past with a quiet dignity, knowing that a single misplaced letter or a misunderstood margin note could fundamentally change the meaning of a philosophical truth for generations to come. Yet the life of a royal scholar in Alexandria is not entirely one of noble, silent suffering. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding how these pampered intellectuals were viewed by the more grounded citizens of the ancient world. Because the elite scholars of the Great Library were fully funded by the royal treasury, provided with free meals, comfortable lodging, and essentially paid an endless stipend simply to think, they often drew the bitter mockery of cynical poets. The ancient satirist Timon of Phlius famously referred to the library's residents as fatted fowls in a coop. He astutely observed that these brilliant minds, perfectly protected from the physical harshness of the outside world, spent their endless, comfortable days fiercely pecking at one another, engaging in petty, vicious arguments over the exact pronunciation of a single word in a poem by Homer. The physical reality of the space where these intense, scholarly battles took place remains something of a lingering mystery. Historians continue to debate whether the Great Library was a single monumental building with a massive awe-inspiring central reading room, or if it was actually a decentralized network of smaller, highly specialized archives and private studies scattered organically throughout the royal gardens. The romantic imagination strongly longs for a towering temple of unified wisdom, but the practical truth of the ancient world often leaned toward complex, sprawling campuses, where different philosophical schools claimed their own quiet corners beneath the sycamore trees. Regardless of its true architectural shape, the library hums with a quiet, desperate energy. The scholars deeply understand that papyrus is fiercely fragile. It is born from the damp reeds of the Nile, and it naturally yearns to return to the earth. It is highly susceptible to coastal moisture, accidental fire, and the relentless appetite of small rodents. To combat this slow decay, the air is kept heavy with the smoke of protective herbs, and the finest scrolls are wrapped in luxurious silk covers or stored tightly in sealed cylindrical clay jars. Every perfectly copied text is a small, defiant victory against the inevitable, creeping erasure of human achievement. As the long afternoon begins to wane, the light inside the reading rooms turns a deep golden amber, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. A scribe carefully wipes the dark ink from her fingers with a piece of rough linen, blowing softly on the final lines of a newly finished scroll. An act of profound, quiet creation. The silence of the room is heavy with the thoughts of the dead, lovingly preserved for the living. All of this collected wisdom, all of these exotic philosophies and intricate maps of distant coastlines, were carried here across the treacherous, unpredictable waters of the Mediterranean. The Great Library is a brilliant mirror reflecting a vast, interconnected world, relying entirely on the courage of those who brave the open water. But how did these heavy wooden vessels, carrying the fragile weight of human knowledge and the heavy bulk of earthly riches, navigate the unpredictable, sprawling vastness of the sea to find this singular haven? Beyond the protective, man-made breakwaters of the Great Harbour, the horizon of the Mediterranean Sea stretches into an unbroken expanse of deep, restless blue. The lifeblood of Alexandria does not merely pulse from within its magnificent stone walls, but arrives daily on the steady, invisible currents of the open wind. To stand on the highest terraces of the city and look northward is to witness a perpetual slow-motion ballet of survival and commerce. Hundreds of square sails, dyed in deep ochres and faded reds, catch the morning light as they navigate the treacherous coastal shoals. The sea is not a gentle companion to these ancient mariners. It is a volatile, unpredictable arena where immense fortunes are either secured in the harbour or swallowed entirely by the dark water. The rhythm of this vast maritime network is dictated by a singular, overwhelming force of nature. It is a mainstream historical fact that the commercial dominance of Alexandria relied heavily on the Etesian winds, a powerful weather phenomenon that blows reliably from the north throughout the long summer months. For ships departing from the rocky coasts of Greece, the wealthy ports of the Levant, or the heart of the Roman Republic, this steady wind acted as a natural invisible highway, pushing heavily laden vessels directly toward the Egyptian coast with incredible speed. Yet this geographical blessing carried a punishing hidden cost. While arriving in Alexandria was swift and deeply profitable, leaving the port to return northward meant battling against those very same relentless winds, requiring ships to painfully zigzag across the sea for weeks, testing the absolute limits of human endurance and the strength of sewn linen sails. When these battered wooden vessels finally drop anchor in the calm waters of the basin, they bring the fragrant, heavy bounty of the known world. The stone docks groan under the weight of the cargo. There are rough clay amphorae sloshing with dark fermented fish sauces from the west, tightly bound bundles of raw heavy silks transported through the deep eastern deserts, and small intensely guarded wooden chests radiating the sharp peppery scent of Indian spices. The air along the waterfront becomes a thick, intoxicating blend of foreign soils, dried cedar, and the sweet, resinous tang of imported frankincense. It is a sensory overload that represents the staggering reach of the Ptolemaic dynasty. However, the chaotic arrival of these raw goods is only the beginning of their journey. Once the cargo is hauled away from the noisy, male-dominated docks, it enters a highly structured, meticulously organised world of domestic commerce. In the cool vaulted storerooms situated just off the main harbour avenues, the women of Alexandria's established mercantile families step forward to manage the true wealth of the city. They are the quiet, analytical minds that translate the reckless gamble of a sea voyage into stable, tangible prosperity. As the heavy wooden crates are pried open, these women expertly assess the quality of the foreign imports, their sharp eyes scanning for the telltale signs of water damage or hidden rot. Their labour is both deeply intellectual and physically demanding. They manage the heavy papyrus ledgers, calculating the complex exchange rates of foreign silver coins and weighing the precious cinnamon bark down to the smallest fraction of an ounce. When the raw, tightly bound silk arrives from the east, it is the women of the household who oversee the delicate, tedious process of unspooling the fragile threads, preparing them to be rewoven into the sheer, coveted garments demanded by the royal court. They anchor the wild, unpredictable nature of global trade to the steady, reliable reality of daily life. Through their profound mathematical precision and their deep understanding of local market demands, these women provide the crucial financial stability that prevents the volatile merchant class from collapsing into ruin. They bear the heavy responsibility of securing their families' futures, moving through the dusty warehouses with a quiet, undeniable authority. The ships that bring these treasures are marvels of heavy timber and thick hemp ropes, but they harbour their own strange, internal ecosystems. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding the defence of the most vital cargo of all, the immense shipments of golden grain. Deep in the dark, shifting holds of the merchant vessels, the threat of starvation did not come from the sea but from the relentless plague of rats gnawing through the woven sacks. To protect the empire's food supply, ancient sailors did not rely solely on the ship's cats. Instead, they frequently released large, non-venomous snakes into the depths of the wooden hulls before a long voyage. These silent, slithering guardians were perfectly adapted to hunting in the tight, suffocating spaces between the clay jars, keeping the vermin population entirely in check while the crew worked in the blinding sun above. The sheer scale of this maritime operation frequently defied belief, leading to lingering questions about the true nature of the Alexandrian fleet. Historians continue to debate whether the legendary gargantuan grain freighters described by ancient chroniclers, vessels reportedly boasting 3 separate decks, onboard bathhouses, and the capacity to carry thousands of tons of cargo, were a standard, functioning part of the everyday trade routes, or if they were merely rare, highly impractical propaganda pieces built by ambitious kings solely to intimidate rival empires. The idea of such colossal wooden leviathans navigating the unpredictable Mediterranean storms borders on the mythological, blurring the line between pragmatic engineering and royal hubris. As the morning stretches into the early afternoon, the frantic energy of the docks begins to subtly shift. The massive sails are furled, the heavy cargo is locked securely away in the shaded storehouses, and the steady Artesian winds begin to momentarily soften. But as the breeze from the water dies down, the true punishing weight of the Egyptian climate descends upon the city. The brilliant white limestone of the streets and the towering marble columns begin to radiate a fierce, baking heat that threatens to bring the bustling metropolis to a complete standstill. How did the ordinary citizens of this crowded, vibrant capital survive this daily, relentless inferno without simply succumbing to the crushing weight of the sun? As the sun climbs to its absolute zenith, the shadows in the streets of Alexandria do not merely shrink, they vanish entirely. The fierce, blinding light of the Mediterranean noon descends upon the city like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The brilliant white limestone of the temples and the pale dust of the broad avenues begin to radiate a harsh, baking heat that forces even the most resilient labourers to seek refuge. The frantic, shouting energy of the morning docks slowly grinds to a halt. The city enters a profound collective silence. To survive the brutal extreme of the Egyptian summer, the inhabitants must understand that the midday heat is not an inconvenience to be pushed through, but a formidable natural force that demands absolute respect and careful strategic evasion. The ability of this dense, sprawling metropolis to endure the daily inferno is not an accident of nature, but a triumph of ancient urban planning. It is a mainstream historical fact that when the original architect, Dinocrates, laid out the foundational grid of Alexandria, he deliberately aligned the massive main avenues to run parallel to the coast, specifically designed to capture the powerful Artesian winds blowing in off the sea. These wide, straight thoroughfares were engineered to act as monumental wind tunnels, actively pulling the cooler, damp marine air deep into the suffocating, sun-baked heart of the urban centre. Yet, even with this brilliant city-wide ventilation, the sheer intensity of the overhead sun requires a more intimate, immediate defence within the walls of every home. As the heavy wooden doors are bolted against the glaring streets, the domestic courtyards transform into shaded sanctuaries of survival. Within these quiet, enclosed spaces, the true tactical mastery of the city's women is fully revealed. They do not rest when the city sleeps, they adapt, seamlessly shifting their authority to manage the delicate microclimate of the household. They are the vigilant guardians against the creeping heat. With quiet efficiency, these women direct the drawing of heavy linen awnings across the open roofs, blocking out the punishing vertical rays while leaving just enough space for the trapped hot air to rise and escape. They move through the dim, cooling corridors, their deeply ingrained knowledge of the environment dictating the rhythm of the afternoon. Their most crucial life-sustaining task during these hours is the meticulous management of water. In the shaded corners of the courtyards, large, porous clay jars known as zirs are strategically positioned to catch the faintest draughts of air. The women expertly wrap these heavy vessels in damp linen cloths. As the hot breeze slowly evaporates the moisture from the fabric and the sweating clay, it draws the heat out of the water inside, miraculously chilling the drinking supply to a refreshing, life-saving temperature. Through these careful, repetitive actions, the women anchor the physical well-being of their families. They bear the silent, vital burden of maintaining comfort and health in a profoundly hostile climate, moving with a dignified grace that turns the desperate fight against the sun into a calm, mastered routine. To further combat the stifling heavy air trapped in the lower rooms of the stone houses, the residents employ a surprisingly effective sensory method of climate control. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding how the ancient Alexandrians created their own rudimentary form of air conditioning. As the heat reached its dangerous peak, the women of the household would sweep the central stone floors entirely clean of dust. They would then take large basins of water, heavily infused with crushed mint, fragrant lotus petals, or sharp cedar oil, and intentionally splash the liquid across the hot pavement. As the shallow, fragrant pools violently evaporated against the heated stone, the process rapidly pulled the thermal energy from the surrounding air, dramatically plunging the temperature of the room while filling the dark, shaded home with a cool botanical sweetness. Beneath these damp, fragrant floors lies an even greater marvel of ancient engineering, hidden entirely from the blinding light of the sun. Historians continue to debate whether the vast labyrinthine network of underground cisterns, carved deep into the bedrock to hold the entire city's fresh water supply, was explicitly designed by royal architects to act as a massive radiant cooling system for the wealthy estates built directly above them, or if the noticeably chilled limestone floors of the patrician villas were merely a happy accidental byproduct of basic water storage. The sheer scale of these subterranean lakes, fed by a complex web of canals drawing from the distant Nile, creates a permanent layer of cold earth directly beneath the burning city, a hidden reservoir of winter preserved in the height of summer. In the dim, quiet hours of the siesta, the pace of life becomes beautifully slow. The exhausted harbour workers sleep on woven reed mats in the coolest corners of the lower rooms. Children rest quietly, their faces wiped with damp cloths, yet the women remain a steady, watchful presence. They use this enforced stillness not for idle rest, but for the quiet, seated labour that keeps the household intact. In the half-light, they mend torn garments, grind spices in heavy stone mortars for the evening meal, and carefully untangle the rough threads of the morning's weaving. Their enduring patience is the quiet pulse of the city, a steady rhythm of care that refuses to be halted by the oppressive weight of the sky. The stark contrast between the blinding, lethal glare of the deserted streets and the cool, fragrant shadows of the interior courtyards is a testament to human ingenuity and endurance. The people of Alexandria do not conquer the desert sun, they outsmart it. They build walls of thick limestone to absorb the blow, they harness the wind, and they rely on the relentless, careful stewardship of the women to weave a fragile safety net of shade and cool water. Eventually, the unforgiving grip of the sun begins to loosen. The harsh vertical light softens into a rich horizontal gold, casting long, deeply purple shadows across the dusty avenues. The baking heat radiating from the stones begins to slowly dissipate into the evening sky. The heavy wooden doors creak open once more, and the city exhales a collective weary breath. The common people emerge from their shaded sanctuaries to enjoy the gentle, cooling breeze of the dusk, preparing for a simple meal of bread and salted fish. But as the ordinary citizens finally find peace in the twilight, what elaborate high-stakes games are just beginning to unfold behind the locked gates of the royal palace, where the coming of the dark is not a time for rest but a theatre for power. As the common city finally finds a well-earned, exhausted peace in the cooling twilight, the heavily guarded royal district of the Bruchion ignites with a completely different, intensely electric energy. The setting of the sun does not bring rest to the vast palace of the Ptolemy. Instead, it signals the beginning of the most crucial high-stakes manoeuvres of the day. The grand dining pavilions, structurally open to the evening sea breeze, are bathed in the golden, flickering light of thousands of cast bronze oil lamps. The scent of roasted pheasant, sharp coriander, and the heavy, sweet smoke of imported frankincense violently replaces the salt air of the harbour. The evening banquet is not a leisurely retreat for the ruling class. It is a highly structured battlefield, where the soft clinking of silver chalices masks the ruthless machinery of ancient politics. The Ptolemaic royal banquet, known as the Symposium, is a masterclass in the theatre of supremacy. It is a mainstream historical fact that the rulers of Alexandria utilized these massive, breathtaking feasts as their primary, most effective weapon of foreign diplomacy, frequently targeting the austere, militarily superior generals of the Roman Republic. By systematically overwhelming their powerful guests with mountains of exotic delicacies, towering centerpieces of solid gold, and literal rivers of spiced, heavily aged wine, the Egyptian court actively sought to prove that their kingdom was simply too valuable, too unfathomably wealthy to ever be dismantled by brute military force. The banquet table serves as a soft, brilliant defense mechanism, designed to conquer the minds of the conquerors through sheer intoxicating luxury. Navigating the dangerous, constantly shifting currents of these feasts falls profoundly upon the noble women of the court. While kings and foreign commanders may grow loud, boastful, and careless under the heavy influence of the vintage wine, these women remain sharply focused, their minds operating with the cold precision of harbour accountants. They are the unseen, brilliant directors of this diplomatic theatre. Draped in fine, tightly pleated linen and adorned with heavy collars of lapis lazuli and beaten gold, they move among the couches with a dignified, deliberate grace. They carefully manage the complex seating arrangements to intentionally separate bitter political rivals or to subtly flatter a suddenly crucial foreign ally. They deeply understand that a single, poorly chosen phrase or a perceived slight over the offering of a prime cut of meat, could easily spark a catastrophic frontier war. The psychological burden they carry within these glittering, noisy halls is immense and profoundly isolating. They must constantly project a flawless image of effortless divine royalty, smiling warmly through the deep exhaustion of the late hour, while quietly analysing every whispered conversation and every lingering, meaningful glance across the room. They act as the vital, stabilising anchors of a volatile dynasty that is constantly threatening to tear itself apart from within. Through their sharp, highly educated intellect and their masterful command of social grace, these women protect the vast borders of the realm just as fiercely as any armoured soldier standing watch in the deep desert. They absorb the crushing pressure of imperial statecraft with an unyielding, quiet strength, ensuring the survival of their bloodline night after night. To guarantee the absolute wide-eyed submission of their guests, the palace frequently engineers displays of wealth that border on the surreal. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding a legendary banquet hosted by the final queen of the dynasty for a visiting Roman general. To aggressively demonstrate the limitless, almost magical fertility of her kingdom, she ordered the stone floor of the massive dining pavilion to be covered entirely in fragrant, freshly blooming rose petals to a staggering depth of nearly 18 inches. To prevent the heavy Roman boots from clumsily stumbling through the floral drifts, a fine, nearly invisible net of woven silk was stretched tightly across the top of the petals. The battle-hardened guests found themselves literally walking upon a suspended, heavily perfumed cloud of out-of-season flowers, a deliberate, deeply unsettling display of absolute power over nature itself. The staggering financial cost required to maintain such elaborate illusions leaves a heavy, lingering shadow over the glittering room. Historians continue to debate whether the overwhelming theatrical excess of these royal feasts was a highly calculated, brilliantly necessary psychological defense meant to permanently awe and stall the encroaching Roman war machine, or if it was simply the fatal blind decadence of an isolated ruling family rapidly draining the royal treasury. Was this magnificent spectacle a complex diplomatic shield, woven by sharp minds to protect a fragile state, or was it merely the final desperate gasp of a dying dynasty, burning its own irreplaceable wealth before the inevitable darkness fell? As the night deepens over the Mediterranean, the air in the pavilion grows thick with the melodic, rhythmic plucking of wooden lyres and the soft splashing of wine. Servants move silently in the dim edges of the room, constantly refilling the massive silver mixing bowls with cold, fresh water drawn from the deep limestone cisterns beneath the palace. The immediate fate of nations is sealed with subtle nods over plates of honey-glazed figs. The glittering machine of the court functions perfectly, completely blinding the outside world to the fragile, deeply human vulnerabilities of the people forced to wear the heavy golden crowns. Yet this magnificent, carefully staged illusion of endless abundance is mathematically impossible to sustain without the relentless, grinding engine of the broader city outside the high walls. The immense wealth poured out onto the banquet floors is extracted, coin by small bronze coin, from the dusty neighbourhood streets and the endless sun-baked fields of the Nile. While the royal court carelessly drinks imported vintages from jewelled cups, the vast majority of Alexandria measures its daily prosperity in simple handfuls of coarse barley and measured drops of pressed olive oil. The true survival of the empire does not rest on the silken nets of the palace, but on the calloused, capable hands of those who rise long before the sun. While the powerful gamble with empires and drift into an uneasy, wine-soaked sleep, who are the vigilant, uncelebrated keepers of the ordinary hearths, waking in the quiet dark to mathematically stretch a meagre handful of grain into yet another day of life? Long before the sun breaches the horizon, while the royal pavilions still reek of spilled wine and heavy perfumes, a profound, necessary stillness blankets the sprawling residential districts of Alexandria. In the cool blue darkness of the pre-dawn, the true uncelebrated engine of the empire quietly begins to turn. The first flicker of light does not come from a gilded lamp, but from the humble, vital spark of flint striking iron. Across thousands of densely packed courtyards, the women of the city rise to awaken the hearth. They move through the dim corridors with a practiced, silent grace, stepping carefully over sleeping children and the cool stone floors. Their morning begins with the sharp, earthy scent of dried tamarisk wood and the rough, abrasive scrape of stone against stone, a rhythmic, grounding sound that serves as the true heartbeat of the ancient world. The physical reality of managing an ancient household requires a staggering combination of sheer muscular endurance and sharp analytical foresight. The survival of the family rests entirely upon the heavy, grueling labour of the saddlestone. Here, women kneel for hours on the hard earth, pushing a heavy, cylindrical upper stone back and forth across a concave base, grinding coarse emmer wheat and tough barley into usable flour. It's a slow, punishing task that permanently alters the skeletal structure of the shoulders and knees over a lifetime. Yet there is a deep, quiet dignity in this repetitive motion. They are not merely preparing a meal, they are actively transforming the raw, unforgiving harvest of the Nile into the literal substance of life, ensuring that the household will endure the harsh day ahead. Beyond the intense physical labour of the oven and the grinding stone, these women operate as the masterful, independent economists of their era. It is a mainstream historical fact that native Egyptian women living under the Ptolemaic dynasty enjoyed a level of legal and financial autonomy that shocked the Greek colonizers who had settled in the city. Unlike the heavily restricted women of classical Athens, Egyptian women possessed the legal right to own land, initiate divorce, execute wills, and sign binding financial contracts entirely without a male guardian. In the shaded corners of the courtyard, they maintain complex mental ledgers. They mathematically calculate the precise daily consumption of pressed olive oil, negotiate the trade of surplus linen for dried fish, and manage the delicate, vital balance of debt and credit within the neighbourhood. They are the absolute, unquestioned pillars of the domestic economy. Their authority extends into the deepest, most spiritual corners of the home. The ancient hearth is a place of profound physical danger, where an unattended ember could quickly consume a neighbourhood, and where the unseen threats of famine or illness constantly linger in the shadows. To combat these deeply human anxieties, the domestic space is guarded by strange, fascinating deities. There is a delightfully quirky historical tidbit regarding the primary protector of the ancient Egyptian kitchen. Tucked safely into the mud brick niches near the fire, one would frequently find small, roughly carved statues of Taweret, a goddess depicted as a fiercely pregnant hippopotamus, standing upright on the hind legs of a lion, displaying the bare, terrifying teeth of a Nile crocodile. To the modern eye, she appears monstrous, but to the women of Alexandria, this fierce, deeply maternal hybrid was a beloved, comforting symbol of aggressive protection, standing permanent guard over the vulnerable heart of the family. The physical structure of these homes reflects the complex, multi-layered reality of the families living within them. As the population of the coastal capital swelled with foreign merchants, Greek soldiers, and native craftsmen, the residential blocks were forced to adapt, stretching upward rather than outward. Historians continue to debate whether the distinct, multi-storied tower houses that became prominent in Ptolemaic Alexandria were a deliberate architectural evolution designed specifically to provide separate, legally distinct economic quarters for these powerful property-owning women, or if the vertical shift was simply a desperate, pragmatic solution to the extreme overcrowding within the city's rigid, unyielding grid. Regardless of their origin, these towering structures became vertical villages, where the complex daily negotiations of shared wells, communal ovens, and overlapping property lines were meticulously managed by the women on each floor. As the sky begins to lighten, turning from deep violet to a pale, dusty rose, the intense heat of the ovens fills the courtyards. The heavy, comforting aroma of baking flatbread rises into the morning air, a universal scent of security. The women wipe the white flour from their foreheads, their hands calloused and strong. They have already accomplished a day's worth of labour before the merchants on the distant harbour have even untied their ships. They carry the immense, silent burden of civilization with an enduring warmth, passing down the intricate knowledge of survival from mother to daughter. They teach the younger girls how to coax a flame from damp wood, how to stretch a small measure of grain with finely ground lotus root, and how to read the subtle, shifting moods of the local market. Their quiet, relentless stewardship is the unbreakable thread that binds the chaotic, multi-ethnic city together. The grand political decrees issued from the marble palaces mean nothing if the neighbourhood granaries sit empty and the hearth fires run cold. The women of Alexandria provide the steady, grounding gravity that prevents the volatile metropolis from spinning into absolute ruin. They are the true, lasting strength of the kingdom, weaving resilience into the very foundations of the city. Yet even with their masterful control over the domestic environment, there are forces that cannot be entirely managed by a careful ledger or a perfectly measured loaf of bread. The densely packed streets, the stagnant water of the canals, and the constant influx of foreign ships create a perfect, invisible breeding ground for ailments that ignore both wealth and wisdom. When the fever suddenly spikes in the middle of the night, or a deep cough settles into a child's lungs, the protective amulets of the hearth offer only a quiet spiritual comfort. But when the limits of basic household care are inevitably reached, and the shadow of severe illness darkens the doorway, to whom did these resilient families turn to battle the terrifying microscopic enemies that threaten to shatter their carefully maintained world? When the heavy, suffocating shadow of illness falls across a threshold, the meticulously calculated ledgers of the household instantly lose their meaning. In the dense, chaotic residential blocks of Alexandria, where the stagnant waters of the canal meet the relentless influx of foreign sailors, disease is a constant, terrifying companion. To battle these invisible enemies, the city relies on a profound, deeply layered system of survival. Here, the art of healing is not merely a single discipline, but a magnificent, fragile confluence of two great rivers of thought: the cold, analytical science imported by the Greeks, and the ancient, deeply rooted botanical wisdom of the native Egyptians. While the elite male physicians gather in the grand, marble-lined academies of the royal district, the immediate visceral reality of neighbourhood care falls quietly upon the women of the city. They are the traditional herbalists, the midwives, and the primary line of defence against the creeping fevers of the harbour. They do not operate in pristine, echoing silence, but in the shaded, dusty alleyways, carrying woven reed baskets heavy with the earthy scents of dried willow bark, crushed coriander, and sticky cedar resin. Their hands, stained dark with the juices of potent plants, carry centuries of unbroken, practical knowledge. They understand that a community's survival depends not on philosophical debate, but on the swift, accurate administration of a bitter poultice or a soothing, deeply restorative balm. The broader, intellectual world deeply admired this bustling capital of cures. It is a mainstream historical fact that Ptolemaic Alexandria was universally recognized as the undisputed medical capital of the ancient Mediterranean, a unique, highly funded environment where royal patronage allowed for the unprecedented dissection and systematic study of the human body. Foreign physicians flocked to the Egyptian coast by the thousands to understand the hidden, mechanical workings of veins, nerves, and vital organs. They mapped the physical shell of humanity with a startling, brilliant precision that would not be matched for centuries. Yet this high-minded anatomical mapping relied entirely on the groundwork laid by the humble street-level apothecaries. The theoretical knowledge of the Greek surgeon was rendered almost entirely useless without the practical, heavily guarded recipes of the Egyptian herbalist. The women who walked the local markets knew the exact, delicate dosage of imported poppy extract required to dull the agonizing pain of a shattered dockworker's limb. They understood precisely how to mix raw frankincense with warm goose fat to seal a severe burn against the damp, infected air blowing in from the sea. Their medicine was not abstract. It was an intensely physical, deeply empathetic labour, born from the desperate necessity of keeping their families alive in a harsh, unforgiving environment. The ancient remedies they prescribed were often a fascinating, highly effective blend of the deeply practical and the visually strange. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding the pervasive, almost universal treatment for severe eye infections, which were a constant blinding threat in the dusty, wind-scoured streets of the capital. Ancient healers frequently prescribed a heavy ointment made from finely crushed green malachite mixed with wild honey, applying the vibrant, thick paste directly to the sensitive edges of the eyelids. While this heavy, colourful application was originally thought by outsiders to be purely a matter of cosmetic vanity or a superstitious magical ward against the evil eye, modern science reveals a brilliant, hidden truth. The heavy copper naturally present within the malachite acted as a highly effective, continuous antibacterial agent, silently destroying the microscopic pathogens breeding in the desert dust. The transmission of this profound, life-saving knowledge was a quiet domestic inheritance, passed directly from mother to daughter in the dim light of the courtyard. Older women taught the young girls how to carefully identify the subtle, easily mistaken differences between a healing root and a deadly poison. They knew instinctively when the shifting Artesian winds would bring the seasonal river fevers, and they prepared their households accordingly, brewing large clay vats of bitter wormwood and mint. Their enduring patience and sharp memories formed an invisible protective shield over the highly vulnerable population of the crowded grid. The relationship between the grand royal medical libraries and these humble neighbourhood healers was deeply complex and fiercely unequal. Historians continue to debate whether the elite, Greek-speaking physicians of the Alexandrian academies actively consulted and genuinely respected the profound, localized botanical wisdom of the native Egyptian women, or if the royal scholars simply appropriated these ancient inherited remedies, aggressively stripping away their local spiritual context and coldly recording the cures as their own sudden, scientific discoveries. The tension between the formal, heavily guarded written scroll and the whispered, handed-down remedy remains a lingering, unresolved shadow over the brilliant legacy of the city's golden age. Regardless of who ultimately claimed the prestige in the archives, the physical reality of healing remained an intimate, exhausting burden. The women who sat up through the long, dark nights, pressing cool, damp linen to the burning foreheads of the sick, were the true, unyielding strength of the ancient medical system. They did not intellectualize suffering from a safe distance, they gently, directly confronted it. Their quiet empathy and steady, practiced hands brought crucial comfort to a sprawling metropolis that was constantly battered by the sea, the harsh sun, and the sheer, brutal friction of ancient life. Eventually, the crisis passes. A deep, steady breath finally returns to the sleeping patient, the burning fever breaks into a cooling sweat, and the profound exhaustion of the long vigil washes over the silent healer. The physical body has been temporarily mended by the bitter herbs of the earth and the patient, uncelebrated watchfulness of the human heart. But medicine, no matter how advanced or deeply rooted in the soil, has its absolute, terrifying limits. When the shadow of mortality grows too dark and the fragile, exhausted vessel of the physical body can no longer be repaired by poultices, quiet care, or the surgeon's sharp knife, where did the people of this fractured, magnificent city turn to heal the profound, invisible wounds of the soul? When the physical limits of ancient medicine are reached, and the bitter herbs can no longer turn the tide of a fading breath, the people of Alexandria do not simply surrender to the dark. They seek a different, profound kind of healing. Rising high above the sprawling, sun-baked grid of the common city is the massive limestone plateau of the Rakotis district. Here the air grows heavy, not with the sharp scents of the harbour or the dust of the loom, but with the thick, sweet smoke of burning myrrh and roasted pine resin. The rhythmic, echoing chants of temple priests drift down into the narrow streets, calling the exhausted populace to the towering columns of the Serapeum. In this monumental sanctuary, the immense, invisible wounds of the soul are brought before the watchful eyes of hybridized gods seeking a peace that the mortal world cannot provide. To govern a metropolis born from the sudden collision of disparate empires, the early rulers of the city recognized that political decrees and military strength were deeply insufficient. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Ptolemaic dynasty intentionally engineered a completely new, syncretic deity to unite their fractured, multi-ethnic capital. They introduced Serapis, a magnificent, carefully calculated blend of the ancient Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis, seamlessly merged with the familiar bearded authority of the Greek gods Zeus and Hades. This hybrid lord of the underworld and agricultural abundance was designed to be universally understood, offering the native farmers of the Nile and the homesick Greek merchants a shared sacred ground where they could stand together in mutual devotion. Yet while the towering marble statues of Serapis commanded the official state-sponsored reverence of the city, the true beating heart of Alexandrian faith belonged to a far older, deeply maternal presence. In the quiet, shadowed alcoves of the temples, the women of the city gathered to honour Isis. She was not a cold, distant figure of authority, but the ultimate, empathetic anchor of the ancient world. To the women who bore the grueling daily burdens of the domestic economy, the weaving, and the relentless care of the sick, Isis was the profound reflection of their own enduring strength. She was the divine mother who had navigated immense grief, the fierce protector who had gathered the scattered pieces of her broken husband, and the silent guardian of the vulnerable. The women who approach her altars move with a quiet, dignified grace, their rough, calloused hands offering small, simple clay lamps filled with precious olive oil. They do not come to debate the abstract, philosophical nature of the cosmos. They come to whisper desperate, deeply personal prayers for a child burning with the harbour fever, or for the safe return of a merchant husband, navigating the treacherous, unpredictable winds of the Mediterranean. Within the protective embrace of Isis, these women find a profound validation of their own unseen labour. The goddess elevates their quiet daily struggles into something sacred, offering a deep, emotional reservoir of hope that allows them to return to the harsh realities of the dusty streets with renewed, quiet resilience. The atmosphere within these grand temples was carefully designed to inspire an overwhelming, visceral sense of divine presence, often blurring the line between spiritual miracle and brilliant, hidden ingenuity. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding the lengths to which the Alexandrian priesthood would go to manifest the power of their gods. Utilizing the advanced mechanical knowledge developed in the city's great libraries, engineers constructed elaborate, hidden pneumatic systems beneath the temple floors. When a devout worshipper approached the massive heavy bronze doors of the inner sanctuary and lit a sacrificial fire on the altar outside, the heat from the flames would silently expand the air in a hidden underground vessel. This invisible pressure would force water into a hanging bucket, the sheer weight of which slowly turned a series of concealed ropes and wooden cylinders, causing the colossal temple doors to mysteriously swing open entirely on their own. To the exhausted, hopeful citizen standing in the courtyard, it was an absolute, undeniable breath of divine magic. The sheer monumental effort required to maintain this unified religious facade leaves lingering questions about the true nature of belief in the ancient capital. Historians continue to debate whether the magnificent, state-sponsored cult of Serapis ever truly captured the genuine, organic devotion of the native Egyptian working class, or if it remained a cynical, top-down political tool utilized primarily by the Greek elite to maintain cultural dominance. Did the neighborhood weavers and harbor laborers truly see their ancient, traditional gods reflected in the beautifully carved Hellenistic marble? Or did they simply bow out of practical necessity while secretly keeping the old unblended ways alive in the quiet shadows of their own domestic hearths? Regardless of the complex, shifting politics of the priesthood, the physical space of the temple provides a vital, necessary release for the overwhelming pressures of the city. As the evening deepens, the flickering light of 1,000 tiny oil lamps cast long dancing shadows against the painted stone walls. A mother carefully adjusts the linen shawl around her shoulders, her head bowed in silent, focused communion. The heavy, protective silence of the sanctuary absorbs her fears, transforming the chaotic, grinding noise of the metropolis into a momentary, profound stillness. She leaves her modest offering on the cool stone, trusting that the invisible, divine currents will carry her prayers into the deep desert or across the dark sea. The spiritual unity of Alexandria, however fragile or engineered it might be, provides the essential calming gravity that keeps the sprawling empire from fracturing under its own immense weight. Yet this magnificent theatre of devotion, the glowing oil lamps, the heavy bronze doors, the fragrant imported incense, and the delicate glass vessels offered to the gods, does not simply appear from the air. Every beautiful, sacred object placed upon the altars requires a staggering amount of earthly labour. While the faithful find peace in the quiet sanctuaries, who are the unseen, meticulous hands labouring in the sweltering, dusty workshops of the lower city, patiently transforming raw, unforgiving sand and dull stone into the coveted, glittering luxuries of the ancient world. Far from the cool, heavily scented silence of the temple sanctuaries, the physical creation of these sacred offerings begins in the choking, blistering heat of the artisan quarters. Tucked away in the narrow, winding alleys behind the main commercial thoroughfares, the atmosphere is radically different from the rest of the city. The air here does not smell of the salty sea or the fresh rain of the approaching winter. Instead, it is intensely thick with the sharp metallic tang of melting copper, the heavy smoke of wood-fired kilns, and the overpowering sweet fragrance of boiling floral resins. This is the industrial heart of Alexandrian luxury. Here, ordinary people with heavily calloused hands and faces darkened by permanent layers of soot perform a daily, grueling alchemy. They take the most ordinary, unforgiving elements of the earth, the dull desert sand, the rough stones, and the crushed roots, and patiently transform them into the most coveted, glittering treasures of the ancient world. The mastery of these humble craftsmen is recognized across the entire Mediterranean. It is a mainstream historical fact that Ptolemaic Alexandria was the undisputed capital of ancient glassmaking, dominating the global trade centuries before the invention of the glass-blowing pipe. In these sweltering workshops, the creation of a single glass vessel requires an agonizing level of patience and physical endurance. Artisans work with a thick glowing paste of molten silica, carefully winding the hot, colourful threads of liquid glass around a core of shaped mud and dung attached to a long metal rod. As the piece slowly cools, they meticulously drag sharp iron tools across the soft surface, creating the iconic, vibrant zigzag patterns that will eventually grace the dining tables of Roman senators and the tombs of distant kings. Once the glass has completely hardened, the rough mud core must be painstakingly scraped out from the inside, leaving behind a flawless, brightly coloured shell. In the shaded courtyard situated just steps away from the roaring heat of the kilns, the delicate, equally intensive work of the perfumeries takes place. This highly lucrative, highly sensitive industry is largely driven by the meticulous, grounded labour of women. While men might manage the heavy lifting of the massive ceramic vats, it is the women who possess the specialised, deeply trained sensory knowledge required to extract the invisible soul of a flower. They sit for hours in the dusty heat, carefully sorting mountains of bruised blue lotus petals, pungent lilies, and bitter almonds. They intimately understand the fragile nature of these raw materials. With steady, practiced hands, they employ the ancient technique of cold pressing, layering the delicate petals between cloths soaked in pure animal fat, allowing the grease to slowly absorb the fragrant essential oils over many days. These women are the quiet, brilliant chemists of the ancient city. They do not merely mix scents for simple vanity. The heavy, oil-based perfumes they create are deeply essential for religious rituals, high-level diplomatic gifts, and basic medical care. Beyond the physical labour of extraction, these women frequently operate as the chief financial managers of the artisan workshops. They carefully weigh the highly expensive imported ingredients on small bronze scales, fiercely negotiating the price of raw myrrh from southern merchants and carefully balancing the workshop ledgers. Their sharp analytical oversight ensures that the immense physical effort of the kilns translates into tangible, lasting survival for their families. They bear the heavy, uncelebrated burden of commercial management, anchoring the chaotic, artistic energy of the neighbourhood with cold, reliable mathematics. The ingenuity found within these dusty alleys often borders on the miraculous, pushing the absolute limits of ancient craftsmanship. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding a specific, highly secretive technique utilised by the city's master glassmakers. To create vessels with impossibly intricate, multicoloured patterns, artisans developed a method that modern historians call mosaic glass. They would arrange thin, differently coloured rods of cold glass into a tight bundle, carefully forming the distinct shape of a flower or even a human face. This bundle was then heated until it fused together, and while still glowing and soft, it was forcefully stretched out into a long, thin cane. As the cane stretched, the image inside shrank but remained perfectly intact. The artisans could then slice this long glass rod horizontally, exactly like slicing a loaf of baked bread, revealing dozens of tidy, perfectly identical miniature faces, which were then pressed into the walls of a larger bowl. It was a breathtaking, microscopic illusion crafted entirely by hand and fire. The immense wealth generated by these dusty, unpretentious workshops was a crucial pillar of the Egyptian economy. However, the exact political structure of the massive industry remains a subject of intense academic scrutiny. Historians continue to debate whether the highly profitable luxury workshops of Alexandria were strictly controlled monopolies, owned and heavily regulated entirely by the Ptolemaic crown to fund their endless military campaigns, or if independent, fiercely competitive family guilds were allowed to operate freely in a decentralised, neighbourhood-driven market. The lack of clear, surviving tax records from the deepest artisan quarters leaves a lingering, unresolved shadow over the true economic freedom of these brilliant, hard-working citizens. Regardless of who ultimately collected the largest share of the silver, the daily reality for the artisans remained one of quiet, dignified sacrifice. The men and women who craft the solid gold jewellery and the perfect translucent glass will never earn enough to own the very objects they create. They spend their entire lives surrounded by immense, breathtaking beauty, yet they return home to simple mud brick houses and meals of coarse barley. Their labour is a profound paradox. They build the magnificent, glittering identity of the empire, but they themselves remain entirely invisible to the distant lands that purchase their wares. As the sun begins to set, the massive kilns are slowly banked, and the thick, black smoke hanging over the artisan quarter begins to dissipate. The women wipe the fragrant, heavy oils from their stained hands, carefully sealing the finished clay vials with thick wax to protect the precious liquids inside. The physical toll of the day is immense, written clearly in the burn scars on their arms and the permanent deep exhaustion in their eyes. They have transformed the raw dust of the earth into lasting perfection. But while these incredible workshops can produce the most coveted luxuries in the known world, a sprawling metropolis cannot be sustained by lapis lazuli and sweet lotus oil alone. When the physical hunger of 1 million working citizens begins to rise, How does the royal administration manage the staggering, logistical nightmare of gathering, storing, and distributing the immense agricultural wealth required to keep this massive, restless city from tearing itself apart in a single night? While the artisan quarters carefully pull fragile beauty from the roaring kilns, the true unbreakable foundation of Alexandria's power relies on a far less glamorous alchemy. Away from the glittering harbours and the fragrant temple altars, massive, heavily guarded stone structures dominate the lower districts of the city. These are the royal granaries, towering fortresses of solid limestone built not to hold soldiers, but to protect mountains of coarse, golden wheat. The survival of this sprawling, multi-ethnic metropolis, and indeed the survival of the entire Ptolemaic Empire, is not guaranteed by the sharp swords of its mercenaries or the delicate glass of its craftsmen. It is secured entirely by the relentless, methodical scratching of 1,000 reed pens in the quiet, dusty archives of the state bureaucracy. To manage a kingdom that stretches across the vast, unpredictable floodplains of the Nile, the rulers of Alexandria could not afford to leave the harvest to chance or simple faith. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Ptolemaic administration engineered one of the most obsessive, tightly controlled, centralized economies the ancient world had ever seen. Long before a single seed was ever dropped into the dark earth, royal scribes were dispatched to the distant agricultural provinces. As the annual floodwaters of the great river slowly receded, leaving behind a thick layer of fertile black mud, these officials meticulously measured the saturated fields with knotted ropes. They calculated the exact anticipated yield of every single plot of land, determining the heavy tax burden months before the grain even began to grow. This staggering level of foresight transformed the chaotic, natural rhythm of agriculture into a cold, predictable mathematics of state survival. At the very centre of this suffocating web of taxation and agricultural quotas, the resilient women of the Egyptian countryside frequently stood their ground as formidable, independent landowners. Unlike the rigid, male-dominated legal systems of the invading Greek elite, the ancient native traditions allowed Egyptian women to inherit, manage, and fiercely defend their own family farms. In the dusty courtyards of the provincial administrative centres, these women step forward to face the state scribes directly. They do not shrink back from the overwhelming authority of the royal ledgers. With sharp analytical minds, they confidently dispute unfair crop assessments, carefully tracking the complex rotation of lentils, barley and flax across their inherited acres. They understand that a mathematical error made by a tired clerk in Alexandria could easily result in the starvation of their entire village by winter. These female landowners are the quiet, unyielding anchors of the rural economy. They hold the legal deeds written on heavy papyrus. They negotiate the rental of heavy plough oxen, and then they meticulously manage the grueling, back-breaking labour of the harvest season. Their fierce intelligence and deep generational knowledge of the river's moods act as a vital counterweight to the cold, distant demands of the royal treasury. They absorb the crushing pressure of the state's endless demands, ensuring that enough grain remains hidden in the local clay silos to keep their families alive through the dry season. The sheer volume of paperwork generated by the massive agricultural machine was completely unprecedented, leading to a highly practical, deeply fascinating solution to a daily problem. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding how the ordinary citizens of the empire managed their daily financial records. While the royal decrees and the grand literary works of the Great Library were recorded on highly expensive, carefully prepared scrolls of papyrus, the common people simply could not afford such luxury for a basic tax receipt or a neighbourhood grain trade. Instead, they relied almost entirely on ostraca, the broken, discarded shards of everyday clay pottery. Millions of these jagged, curved fragments littered the streets and the garbage heaps of the ancient world. Scribes and commoners alike would simply pick up a broken piece of a wine jug, dip their reed pen into the black soot ink, and quickly scratch out a binding legal contract or a receipt for a bushel of wheat. The bureaucracy of the empire literally functioned on the shattered garbage of its citizens. The atmosphere within the central archival halls of Alexandria is intensely quiet, heavy with the smell of dry dust and old ink. Hundreds of men sit cross-legged on the cool stone floors, surrounded by towering, precarious stacks of papyrus rolls and baskets overflowing with inscribed pottery shards. The physical toll of this sedentary labour is immense. Their backs are permanently curved from leaning over the ledgers, their fingers darkly stained, their eyes constantly strained by the dim light of the high windows. They are the unseen cogs in a massive machine, reducing the chaotic, sweaty reality of the harvest into neat, endless columns of numbers. Every shipment of grain that arrives in the Great Harbour must be painstakingly cross-referenced with the original predictions made months prior in the distant mud. The immense scale of this micromanagement leaves a deep, unresolved shadow over the legacy of the dynasty. Historians continue to debate whether this suffocating, incredibly invasive bureaucracy was the brilliant, necessary engine that effectively saved the fragile Egyptian economy from total collapse during years of poor river floods, or if it was a tyrannical, parasitic system that ultimately crushed the spirit of the native farmers, slowly bleeding the countryside dry to fund the luxurious, glittering banquets of the capital. The delicate balance between state security and widespread undocumented resentment was constantly teetering on a knife's edge. Yet, as the long afternoon turns to dusk, the scribes carefully wipe their pens and tie the heavy linen strings around the final scrolls of the day. The royal granaries are full, the massive wooden doors barred and sealed with wet clay. The physical survival of the empire has been successfully calculated, recorded, and heavily guarded for another night. The mechanics of the city have ensured that there will be bread in the markets tomorrow. But while the scribes can meticulously track every single grain of wheat and every drop of taxed oil to sustain the physical body of the kingdom, who carries the far heavier, entirely unwritten responsibility of nurturing the minds, the morals, and the ancient cultural soul of the generation that will one day inherit this sprawling, deeply complex world? The heavy wooden doors of the state granaries securely seal away the physical wealth of the empire, and the grand ledgers of the royal scribes quietly rest in the dark. Yet the true unbreakable endurance of Alexandria is not stored in cold limestone vaults, nor is it written in black ink on fragile papyrus. It resides in the quiet, shadowed corners of the domestic courtyards as the harsh Mediterranean sun finally surrenders to the evening. Here, far from the brutal mathematics of taxation and the loud, boastful politics of the harbour, the most profound and vital labour of the ancient world begins. The relentless, lifelong responsibility of raising the next generation and imparting the deep, cultural soul of the kingdom falls entirely and steadfastly upon the women of the city. To bring a child into the ancient world and to successfully guide them past the terrifying, ever-present shadow of early mortality requires an immense reservoir of physical stamina and profound emotional courage. The women of Alexandria bear this heavy burden with a quiet, fierce dignity. They do not have the luxury of modern certainties. Every sudden fever, every harsh cough carried on the damp sea wind represents an absolute, potentially devastating crisis. The deep grief of sudden loss is a universally understood undercurrent in these neighbourhoods, a silent sorrow that binds the women of the city together in mutual empathy. Yet this constant vulnerability does not harden them. Instead, it transforms the daily acts of motherhood. The careful mashing of lentils, the weaving of warm linen tunics, the gentle washing of small dusty feet, into acts of profound, defiant hope. As these children grow, the courtyard becomes their first and most deeply influential academy. It is a mainstream historical fact that while the Ptolemaic state aggressively funded the gymnasium, a formal, highly structured educational institution designed specifically to train the young boys of the elite in Greek athletics, military tactics, and classical philosophy, the foundational shaping years of life belonged entirely to the mother. Long before a child ever held a wooden practice sword or recited a line of Homer, their entire understanding of the world was meticulously woven by the women of the household. In the heavily mixed, multi-ethnic neighbourhoods of the capital, native Egyptian mothers served as the primary, unyielding transmitters of ancient culture. They taught their children the complex, melodic cadence of the native tongue, ensuring that the ancient language survived the overwhelming wave of Greek colonization. The stories whispered in the dim, flickering light of the hearth fires are not the sanitized, state-approved histories of the royal court. These mothers pass down the visceral, deeply rooted mythology of the Nile. They teach their children how to respect the dangerous, life-giving power of the river, how to recognize the shifting constellations of the desert ski, and how to navigate a world completely saturated with invisible divine forces. Their quiet, nightly instruction anchors the children to the ancient soil, providing a profound, stable identity that the distant, glittering marble of the palace could never offer. Protecting these vulnerable minds and bodies from the unseen dangers of the night required practices that blend deep maternal love with fascinating ancient mysticism. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding how mothers fiercely guarded their sleeping infants from the terrors of the dark. In many households, women kept specialized curved wands carved directly from the heavy ivory of hippopotamus tusks. These smooth, heavy objects were densely inscribed with terrifying chaotic figures: snakes, lions, and monstrous knife-wielding deities. When a child was placed on their woven reed mat for the night, the mother would use the tip of this ivory wand to physically trace a shallow circle in the dust entirely around the bed. It was a fierce protective magic, a literal boundary drawn in the earth to aggressively ward off the restless spirits and creeping scorpions that haunted the ancient night. The immense power of this domestic maternal influence frequently clashed with the rigid, organized ambitions of the ruling dynasty. Historians continue to debate whether the aggressive, state-sponsored expansion of the Greek educational system was a deliberate, calculated attempt to systematically erase the native Egyptian identity and language among the youth, or if the overwhelming intimate influence of these mothers within mixed heritage households simply absorbed the Hellenistic culture, creating a uniquely bicultural, fiercely independent generation that entirely defied the rigid demographic categories of the royal ledgers. Did the state truly conquer the minds of the next generation? Or did the quiet, relentless instruction of the mothers fundamentally change the nature of the conquerors from within the very heart of the home? The women who sit in the cooling darkness, their hands gently resting on the sleeping shoulders of their children, are the unseen, undeniable architects of the future. They do not build towering monuments of stone, nor do they carve their names into the grand temple walls. Their legacy is entirely living, breathing, and walking the dusty streets of the capital. They take the chaotic, terrifying reality of the ancient world and carefully filter it through a lens of enduring warmth and rigorous survival, crafting a resilient citizenry capable of outlasting the fragile warring empires of the Mediterranean. Their silent, monumental effort is the deepest, most essential foundation of civilization. Without their patient, daily dedication, the sprawling metropolis would quickly fracture into a disconnected, chaotic mob. The profound respect they command within the family is not mandated by a royal decree. It is earned through years of sleepless nights, quiet sacrifices, and the steady, unbreakable transmission of human memory. As the deep velvet blue of the Egyptian night finally consumes the sky, the relentless grinding noise of the vast city fades into a gentle, rhythmic calm. The small, flickering oil lamps in the courtyards are carefully extinguished one by one, and the exhausted mothers of Alexandria finally seek their own brief, hard-won rest. The mainland surrenders entirely to the absolute heavy darkness of the ancient world. But as the sprawling neighborhoods fall silent under the stars, how did this massive coastal empire guide its weary, wave-battered sailors through the treacherous, blinding black waters of the sea, bringing the wealth of the world safely back to the quiet, waiting hearths? As the absolute heavy darkness of the ancient world settles over the sun-sprawling residential blocks, the Mediterranean Sea transforms into a terrifying, featureless void. To the exhausted sailors caught miles off the Egyptian coast, the night is a profound, deeply isolating enemy. The treacherous limestone shoals and shifting sandbanks that guard the harbour are entirely invisible, waiting beneath the black water to tear the hulls of heavy merchant galleys apart. Yet, just as the despair of the open sea threatens to overwhelm the weary crews, a sudden, brilliant star is born upon the horizon. It is not a celestial body, but a magnificent roaring triumph of human engineering. Rising from the small limestone island at the edge of the harbour is the Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria, aggressively piercing the night with a beam of golden, unnatural light. The sheer monumental scale of this structure defies the natural landscape. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Pharos of Alexandria, standing an estimated 300 feet above the crashing waves, was the very first lighthouse ever constructed in the ancient world, becoming the towering blueprint for all that would follow. It was not merely a tall building, but a highly complex, three-tiered fortress of solid marble and limestone blocks, bound together with molten lead to withstand the violent, relentless pounding of the winter storms. For the sailors fighting the heavy ocean swells, the sudden appearance of its light is a profound, emotional anchor, an undeniable promise of safety, warm hearths, and survival. Maintaining this brilliant, life-saving beacon requires a massive, unceasing orchestration of physical labour hidden entirely within the stone walls. The fire at the summit cannot be allowed to die, not even for a moment. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding the grueling logistics of feeding this hungry giant. Because the massive bronze braziers at the top required an astonishing constant supply of dried acacia wood and animal dung, the architects designed the interior of the lower tower, not with stairs, but with a wide, gently sloping spiral ramp. Day and night, exhausted donkeys and mules were continuously driven up this dark internal tunnel, carrying heavy loads of fuel to the very sky. The great light that guided the wealth of empires was, in reality, kept alive by the patient, trudging steps of beasts of burden walking in endless circles in the dark. While the men labour within the tower to feed the flames, the profound emotional weight of that light is carried by the women standing vigil on the flat, darkened roofs of the city. They look out across the black water, the cold sea wind pulling at their linen shawls. For the wives, mothers, and daughters of the mercantile fleets, the pharaohs is deeply personal. It is the glowing tether that connects their carefully managed, quiet courtyards to the wild, unpredictable dangers of the sea. They intimately understand the cargo those ships carry, the spices they will negotiate, the raw silk they will weave, the grain that will feed their children. Their profound, silent endurance mirrors the steady, unblinking fire of the lighthouse. They anchor the emotional and economic reality of the harbour, offering a quiet, deeply rooted gravity that calls the wandering sailors back to the safety of the hearth. The intense brilliance of the lighthouse was achieved through a marvel of optical science that completely bewildered the ancient world. At the very top of the structure, behind the roaring fire, sat a colossal, meticulously polished mirror, likely crafted from highly reflective bronze. This mirror gathered the chaotic, scattering light of the flames and focused it into a single piercing beam that could reportedly be seen for nearly 30 miles out to sea. This technological marvel was so powerful that it birthed enduring, terrifying legends. Historians continue to debate whether this massive, highly polished mirror was ever secretly weaponized by the city's brilliant engineers to focus the blinding, burning rays of the daytime sun onto enemy ships, literally setting them on fire before they could reach the harbour. Or if this terrifying weapon was merely a fantastic, exaggerated myth born from the sheer, overwhelming awe the structure inspired. Regardless of the lingering myths, the physical reality of the pharaohs casts a long, protective shadow over the resting city. The beam sweeps slowly across the dark water, illuminating the white crests of the waves. It is a beacon of profound, calculated supremacy. It violently rejects the chaos of the natural world, declaring to the darkness that Alexandria is a place of order, intellect, and unyielding wealth. The light cuts through the thick sea fog, guiding the bruised, salt-stained timber of the galleys carefully past the deadly reefs and into the calm, protected basin of the great harbour. As the ships finally drop their heavy stone anchors into the quiet water, the exhausted crews collapse onto the wooden decks, their faces bathed in the warm, distant glow of the tower. They have survived the terrifying expanse of the Mediterranean, brought home by the brilliant mathematics of the scholars and the relentless, unseen labour of the fuel carriers. The city sleeps securely behind its massive breakwaters, protected by the gods, the scribes, the weavers, and the steady, enduring women who maintain the very fabric of life. The great lighthouse stands as the ultimate, glowing testament to the ambition of a golden age, a time when human hands built mountains of stone and commanded the light itself. Yet nothing forged by mortal hands is entirely immune to the slow, relentless grinding of the earth. The massive stones of the pharaohs, the fragile papyrus of the Great Library, and the glittering palaces of the Ptolemies will eventually face the absolute, undeniable judgment of time and tectonic shifting. But when the fires finally burn out and the grand monuments inevitably crumble into the dark sea, what enduring, unbreakable spirit remained to prove that this magnificent, sun-baked capital was never truly lost to the dust? The grand illusion of absolute permanence is the fatal flaw of every ancient empire. The Ptolemaic kings and queens built their magnificent capital with the firm belief that heavy limestone and polished marble could somehow freeze time, effectively commanding the unpredictable earth to stand perfectly still. Yet, the physical world is profoundly indifferent to the ambitions of royalty. The Mediterranean Sea, which brought such staggering, endless wealth to the great harbour, is fundamentally restless. It is a mainstream historical fact that the glittering architectural marvels of Alexandria, the sprawling royal palaces of the Bruchion, the massive temples, and even the towering, life-saving Pharaoh's lighthouse, were eventually dragged down into the dark, silent depths by a series of devastating, massive earthquakes and tsunamis, most notably the catastrophic seismic event of the 4th century. The earth violently fractured, and the sea simply rose up to reclaim the heavy stones, pulling the very centre of the ancient world beneath the cold waves. The sudden, terrifying loss of these monumental structures shattered the physical skyline of the capital, leaving a profound, lingering question about the true end of this golden era. Historians continue to debate whether the ultimate, irreversible decline of Alexandria's supremacy was primarily caused by these sudden, catastrophic natural disasters that physically broke the back of the city's infrastructure, or if it was actually a slow, inevitable cultural suffocation brought on by the heavy, unimaginative bureaucracy of the Roman occupation that slowly drained the vibrant, independent spirit of the Egyptian coast. Did the city die in a sudden roar of rushing water? Or did it simply fade away under the crushing weight of foreign taxation and endless, rigid decrees? Yet the most profound revelations about the survival of the city do not come from the grand, unbroken statues, but from the quiet, intimate debris left behind. There is a deeply quirky historical tidbit regarding the modern underwater excavations of these sunken royal quarters. When marine archaeologists dive into the murky green depths of the harbour to map the lost palaces, they do not merely find the colossal drowned faces of stone gods and the heavy granite blocks of fallen arches. Nestled directly against the cheek of a submerged sphinx, hidden entirely in the shifting sand for centuries, divers frequently uncover the smallest, most humble artefacts of daily life. A perfectly preserved, carved bone hairpin, a heavily worn clay loom weight, or a small porous stone used for grinding domestic spices. These tiny, unassuming objects, resting quietly beside the shattered ruins of absolute power, offer a striking, beautiful paradox. The grand monuments of the kings fractured and fell, but the simple, uncelebrated tools of the ordinary people survive the crushing weight of the sea entirely intact. These small physical remnants serve as a quiet, powerful reminder that history is not merely made by those who issue commands from the throne, but by those whose daily, patient labour actually sustains the pulse of the kingdom. This silent underwater tableau reveals the deepest, most enduring truth of Alexandria. The true eternity of the city was never actually carved into the marble of the temples, nor was it successfully locked away in the fragile, burning scrolls of the Great Library. The actual unbreakable foundation of the culture was carried steadily, day after day, in the calloused hands of the women who managed the domestic hearths. When the palaces crumbled and the royal decrees lost their meaning, the rhythm of the city did not stop. The women simply continued to weave the protective linen, grind the heavy grain, and press the medicinal oils, adapting to the shifting political winds with a quiet, undeniable resilience. They were the ultimate living preservers of the ancient world. While the intellectual men of the academies loudly debated the abstract nature of the soul, the women of the residential grids quietly ensured that the physical body of the culture survived the harsh realities of the era. Their daily repetitive labour was not a symbol of subjugation, but a profound, necessary act of supreme endurance. It required a physical strength and an emotional fortitude that rivaled the bravest soldiers serving in the distant desert garrisons. They faced the constant, terrifying threats of famine, disease, and societal collapse without the protection of armour, armed only with their sharp intellect and their deep, unwavering devotion to their families. They carried the complex, melodic language of their ancestors, the deeply rooted botanical wisdom of the neighbourhood healers, and the quiet maternal protection of the household gods safely through the violent transitions of empire. The knowledge they passed down to their daughters in the cooling twilight of the courtyards proved far more resilient than the heavily guarded, sealed archives of the state bureaucracy. To understand the lasting legacy of this magnificent coastal capital, one must look past the glittering, romanticised myths of conquered queens and fallen lighthouses. The spirit of Alexandria endures precisely because it was forged in the dusty, sweltering alleys of the artisan quarters and the crowded, noisy markets of the common city. The women who mathematically stretched a meagre harvest to feed a family, who fiercely negotiated the price of imported silk, and who sat awake through the long, dark nights to cool a fevered child. These are the true eternal architects of the Mediterranean world. They did not demand golden statues, and they did not carve their names into the heavy limestone. Their monument is the continued, unbroken survival of humanity itself, a steady, pulsing rhythm of care and fierce capability that outlasted the emperors. The city of Alexandria still stands today, a bustling, vibrant metropolis built directly over the hidden, echoing chambers of the past. The wind still blows steadily from the north, and the dark water of the harbour still reflects the brilliant, blinding light of the midday sun. The grand theatrical politics of the ancient world have long since turned to dust, but the profound, quiet strength of the people who originally built this world remains. Every time a thread is woven, every time a fire is carefully coaxed from the dark, and every time a mother whispers a comforting ancient story to a sleeping child, the resilient, unbreakable soul of the ancient city breathes again. They were the quiet pillars of the earth, holding the sky aloft while the kings played their temporary fragile games. The sun finally dips below the edge of the western desert, taking the harsh, demanding heat of the long day with it. The sprawling ancient metropolis slowly exhales, releasing the heavy burdens of labor, politics, and survival into the cool, forgiving night air. The rhythmic, echoing thumping of the heavy wooden looms has finally ceased in the quiet courtyards. The roaring, intense fires of the artisan kilns have softened into a deep, quiet bed of glowing red embers. The towering, majestic columns of the limestone temples stand silently under a vast, brilliant canopy of stars, guarding the peaceful sleep of a city that has finally laid down its tools. There is a profound, deeply comforting stillness that settles over the ancient world. The relentless, grinding efforts of the past have long since concluded. The calloused hands of the weavers, the sharp, calculating minds of the scholars, and the vigilant, weary eyes of the mothers have all found their eternal, well-deserved rest. Their immense daily struggles, their silent fears, and their quiet, beautiful victories belong to the soft dust of history now. They are safely wrapped in the gentle shadows of the centuries, preserved entirely safe from the unpredictable, shifting currents of time and the heavy demands of the waking world. As the gentle, rhythmic waves of the dark Mediterranean Sea lap softly against the ancient, weathered stones of the harbour, whispering old, forgotten secrets to the shore, the ancient world simply lets go. The heavy burdens of the day are completely lifted, floating away on the cool sea breeze. There is nothing left to build, nothing left to meticulously record, and absolutely nothing left to fear. The long, magnificent story of the ancient capital slowly fades into a gentle, soothing silence, leaving behind only the peaceful, unbroken calm of the eternal night. The past is safely asleep, resting deeply beneath the quiet earth and the still, dark water.